as a distinguished fellow with us. So that's great. Antoinette, just prior to joining us, was director of the IMF's Africa Department. Prior to that, she served as Liberia's Minister of Finance and also had a distinguished career at the World Bank. And as I've mentioned Sarah a number of times now, but let me just say Sarah, who will serve as our moderator, was co-author of this report. Herself has also, in addition to being a senior policy analyst here at the center, has had stints at USAID and MCC. So we have it, and why don't you join me in welcoming our panel.
First of all, I'd like to echo Scott's thanks to all of you for being here today, and I especially want to thank our panel who've agreed to share with us their expert insights on implementing the principle of country ownership in practice. So today we're starting the panel from the premise that country ownership is a valuable principle. So the goal of the panel today is to really take advantage of the deep expertise of our panelists here today to talk through the things that donor agencies grapple with as they try to implement ownership. We'll hope to hear about some of the key lessons learned along the way about how to do ownership well, as well as how to appropriately balance the focus on ownership with other important agency requirements and needs. So Patricia, I'm hoping that you can maybe start us off. Okay. So USAID's strong institutional push to sharpen its focus on country ownership got a major boost in 2010 with the launch of USAID Forward. And so just recently, back in September of last year, the agency issued several revisions to its operational guidance, including very prominently a more explicit focus on supporting locally owned sustainable development. So Patricia, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about this shift. And so what were some of the lessons over the past 6 years of implementing USAID Forward that prompted these changes?
Good question. Can you hear me as I speak? Am I on? Yeah, good, because my voice doesn't always carry so well. Yeah, so as part of USAID Forward, at the beginning of the Obama administration, the then administrator instituted implementation of procurement reform. And it was really to reach out and do more direct funding to countries to build country ownership. And it was both government to government and also involved funding, direct funding to civil society partners and private sector partners. And so I happened to be overseas at the time, but so it was really a major shift in the way we did business. And so there was a target set that 30% of our money should be going directly to countries and to host country partners. And as we began to implement that, it was a major shift, and it really I happened to be on a mission in Liberia, and it was a shift. And so we really had to think about how to do business differently, and I think that was important. As we began to implement it, we began to realize and learn and kind of look at the evidence that perhaps setting out a target of inputs was not really the best way to go. It started us, and it started us thinking, and we learned from it. But then we began to think it's really about the outcomes. It's the what are we creating here? And so over time, as we monitored and thought about it, we realized we began to think not of what we called IPR, but we began to think of something which began to be called local solutions, which is really based on doing what's development effectiveness, how do you build ownership, how do you work with partners in the countries that you're working in, and what's the best way to do that. So local solutions really became, we kind of incubated and catalyzed an approach where we really reached out to local partners, governments, civil society, private sector, to really try to build the ownership of the programs that we were working on. So while we continued to measure the inputs, because it's an indicator that you can measure, and that's doubled in the time since we started, we realized that it's a much more complicated approach, and we really have to look holistically across a country to think about how do you work with partners, how do you identify priorities, how do you get local partners to put resources in the game, to have skin in the game, and then how do you work together to design and implement what you're doing. So that was the beginning, IPR, then we went to local solutions, and then I'm happy to report that the more we thought about the approach, we shouldn't really be thinking of it as special approach and let's look how we're doing in local solutions and let's really promote that and incubate it and catalyze it. Let's really take it and institutionalize it so it really is how we do our business across our programming. This is good development and this is what we should be doing. So in September, this past September, we launched a new revised policy guidance on how we do our business overseas, which we call the program cycle, which includes strategic planning, project design, this will be familiar to all of you, activity design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So, and including 4 key principles across how we do our work overseas. It's about adaptive management. It's about monitoring what's going on, adapting to what's going on, and then changing your strategy or your project to be successful. It includes building sustainability through local ownership, a key principle. Another is using different approaches, innovation, partnering, a whole range of tools and things to make sure that we work together to have evidence-based, sustainable, and through adaptive management really be more successful than we've been. So then rather starting as IPR, moving to local solutions to incubate it, really talking about this has to be one of our key principles in the way we do business. And I'll stop, but I think we're just on the threshold of this. And what it will mean for aid is changing the culture, capacity building across our staff, changing the way we do business, creating the incentives so people say, wait a minute, this isn't right, how do I change it? So let me stop there. But that's the trajectory that we've come from since the beginning of the Obama administration.
Thank you, and best of luck in the way forward under the new guidance as well. So Kay, as Scott mentioned, you've been at MCC from the beginning. So you've seen a great evolution in the agency and how it implements its operational model, which is based on core precepts of aid effectiveness, including the importance of country ownership. So country ownership has always been a core tenet of MCC's model. But in your opinion, what are the chief ways that MCC's interpretation of this and application of it has evolved over the agency's 10 plus years at this point?
Yeah. So as Scott mentioned, I was there. I started at MCC in 2004, the year it was created. So I was one of the, I think, first 50 employees at MCC. And so we embarked on this very ambitious mission of kind of standing up the agency while also engaging with our country partners. And at that time, we had 16 country partners identified. And so we went on these sort of rapid tour around the world with introductory visits and met with these countries. And I think our interpretation of country ownership was really, we'll ask you, please submit a proposal that you think addresses poverty reduction through economic growth. It has to be consistent with your national development strategies. You have to go through public consultation, and then we'll kind of give you feedback on whether it's good enough. And so, our first country partner that we signed a compact with, Madagascar, I remember getting an email from my counterpart, Emma Raleigh-Jean at the time, and she said, this process is so confusing. It feels very much like ping pong. We keep sending you a proposal. You keep saying, no, it's not quite right. Move to the left. No, move to the right. And it actually became, I think, what we thought was something very positive became somewhat confusing and negative for our country partners. So what they wanted was more sort of direction. What do you guys really want? What is really going to pass muster? What's really going to meet your investment criteria? And so we went through a process of collecting a number of proposals for countries. Sometimes we would get 20 proposals for the country, and then we would go through a vetting process and due diligence and kind of chop them one by one, breaking hearts of ministers in various communities through this process, which was not fun. And then we decided we need some structure. And so that's when we instituted several years ago, I think it was in 2008, where we instituted a growth diagnostic approach based on a Harvard model in what we call the constraints analysis. So we said, country, let's work together on what are your constraints to economic growth. let's identify these binding constraints together, and that through that lens, let's identify projects that will address those binding constraints. That will provide more structure to this process. It'll become much more predictable in what we would say actually passes muster, and I think is both something helpful for the country that they will use actually in their national strategies and working with other development partners. So that was, I think, one of the major, changes in our processes of identifying country priorities. The other, I think MCC is quite known for its cost-benefit analysis. So all the projects that we invest in have to meet a 10% hurdle rate for economic rate of return. And so being very, very clear with that up front, I think, and also working side by side with our country counterparts on coming up with this cost-benefit analysis also provided more predictability and clarity on what MCC wanted and what would meet our investment criteria. So I think that this process has really evolved over the last 12 years, and we're still learning about what works and what doesn't in both designing the projects and implementing them.
Thank you. So Antoinette, you spent much of your career with the multilateral development banks. So data from the 2014 Reform Effort Survey by William and Mary that we explore in the paper on the use and utility of country ownership, as well as CGD's quota index. See, this data shows similar trends, that multilaterals tend to more frequently pursue the approaches that tend to put countries more in the driver's seat, things like budget support, paying for outcomes, et cetera. So I'm curious, what do you think, in your perception, what's different about the structure or the operations of multilaterals that enable them to pursue country ownership in a different way than bilateral donors? And on the flip side of that, what advantages or opportunities do bilaterals have that multilaterals don't in this area?
Okay, no, thanks for that question, actually. But just to say that certainly I've spent the bulk of my career at the World Bank and at the International Monetary Fund. Mm-hmm. And of course, they're both multilateral, but the fund is not a development bank as such, but a financial institution, of course. And I've been fortunate enough to be on the other side as well, and to see how, in fact, our international partners work with countries like Liberia, emerging from conflict in particular, with very scarce capacity and in a big hurry to achieve results. So. For me, a very, very fulfilling career in that sense, having seen both sides and having learned quite a bit from both sides. Mm-hmm. But the multilaterals, of course, are multilateral, so they're owned by many countries, unlike bilaterals who report to a unique authority. Okay. And in that regard, multilaterals have a more complicated, I would say, job to do in terms of convincing their stakeholders and their authorities, their governors and shareholders, about even-handedness and treating countries across the same, about learning from countries across the board and applying those lessons to convince countries that there's a good and valuable way of approaching something from across our experience in many countries. Certainly, bilaterals learn that, of course, in their work as well. But I think there's a lot more pressure in multilateral institutions to demonstrate that we're actually exercising even-handedness, treating countries the same. Given their needs and given the capacities they have to implement projects and programs. I also think there's a huge amount of work around capacity development that both multilaterals and bilaterals support, of course. But the multilaterals, like the World Bank, for example, with a very large presence on the ground, is sometimes better situated in terms of being able to, on a day-to-day basis, provide that support for capacity development, which really is really a day-to-day thing, and it doesn't respond as well to multilateral institutions like the IMF that has a much less presence on the ground and has to come back and forth. These days, of course, IMF has African technical assistance centers, and that helps because they're on the ground nearer the countries and can do more back and forth. But you know, I think the other thing I wanted to mention about the differences between the two, of course, there's a political agenda, of course, to development assistance that bilaterals provide. And they have their own foreign policy objectives that they seek to further also by the support they give countries. That's less the case in the multilaterals, of course, because their agenda is multilateral and is owned by many and really spoken through in a much more, I would say, a way that raises a lot more questions simply because there are different perspectives on the issue. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here. So there's widespread agreement, as Scott mentioned up front, that most people think country ownership is valuable. But it's not the only thing that donors think is valuable. It's not the only thing they want to pursue. Donors are interested in programmatic results. They're interested in cost efficiency, timely implementation. They have requirements around accountability to Congress, taxpayers, boards of directors, et cetera. So I want to talk a little bit about how agencies think about these trade-offs. So Patricia, so one of the prominent ways, which you mentioned, that USAID is pursuing ownership of implementation is through local solutions, the effort to increase the proportion of direct mission funding to local organizations. And as you mentioned, the agency's seen some real progress, some real advances in this area, doubling the percentage of funds that are going to local entities since 2010. In fact, Liberia, which is one of our case studies that we talk a little bit about in the paper and where you were formerly mission director not too long ago, it's a great example because here USAID pursued a financing mechanism that allowed USAID health funding to flow directly through the Ministry of Finance, directly to the Ministry of Health. On the other hand, missions do take on certain new fiduciary and programmatic risks when they forge new partnerships with local organizations. So risk aversion can certainly dampen appetites for pursuing new ways of doing business. So how is USAID encouraging missions to weigh these risks against potential benefits of local partnerships? Some risk aversion is obviously appropriate, but what can help missions and different roles within missions that weigh risk differently depending on the position that they hold? How can USAID help them understand how they should go about making calculated risks in pursuit of the agency's goals?
That's an interesting question, actually. In terms of risk management, historically our agency has concerned itself, because we're responsible to the Congress for our appropriations, obviously, we've concerned ourselves with financial risk and safeguards. And over the years, and particularly recently, it's become clear that we have to broaden our definition of risk. And in response to an OMB requirement that, across the government, we are really looking at identifying the different kinds of risks there are and mitigation issues, right? And so I think in the first instance, if you're talking about risk from a risk point of view, that we really need to broaden our approach and we really have to think about the costs and the benefits. And so I think one of the challenges in building local ownership is while we're all convinced that it's good development and our hypothesis is it leads to more sustainable outcomes, the question is to really identify what we think that the risks are up front, and we can go into them a little bit and we might agree on them, and then what the benefits are. And I think one of the challenges is we don't have the evidence to really prove what the benefits are, right? So if you're doing a risk-benefit analysis, right? So I think it's hard. So I think what we'll have to be doing as part of our risk management approach in the agency is to really work with missions to determine what the real risks are and then work together, I think, as a development community to develop the evidence of the benefits that we kind of hypothesize, but we're not, it's hard to point to. I think that some of the clear risks or some of the, let me put challenges in terms of local ownership is capacity of local groups, and so building the capacity, and that's clearly important, and we should do it, but it's a time issue. And so when we started thinking about giving funds directly to local entities, one of the risks is their capacity to deal with the money, right? So you really have to take, what is it you're trying to achieve in terms of development income, outputs? And what are the best ways to reach that? And if you want to use local ownership in terms of building capacity and building chances for sustainability, then you really, as part of your analysis and design and working with local partners to think, what are the right mechanisms, what are the right approaches? Do we give the money directly to a local institution, or do we work through an international donor, or do we do it directly to build the capacity so that when we leave, there will be capacity built and there will be sustainability? So I think the risk benefit's difficult, and we really, each mission in each case has to think through what the risks are, and is it different working through local ownership, so building local ownership, and what those benefits are. And so I don't have an answer to it, but it's absolutely something that we're going to be focused on and helping missions to deal with. But I think, we all have to work together to see the benefit stream, the evidence of the outcomes. And while we all believe it, we're just beginning, and we haven't been doing it long enough to really see what those streams are, and that'll be key. And so we're looking forward to working with missions to learn these things. So thank you for the question. I'm interested in others' responses.
Well, I was going to ask Kay, actually, because in 2011, MCC came out with a document talking about its approach to country ownership, which was comprehensive and transparent about the challenges as well as the benefits to ownership. And it wrote at that time that in the name of capacity building and ownership, MCC would often prefer to allow more time for learning and for country counterparts to take the lead in solving implementation challenges. But it says because MCC is accountable to Congress and U.S. taxpayers for achieving results within a 5-year time frame, this creates the incentive and the expectation that MCC would engage proactively to keep investments on track and meet their goals. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about this, and how would you characterize how the institution is dealing with this trade-off today as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's something that we live on a day-to-day basis, because there is this sense of urgency. I think many of you know that in our statute, our compacts are restricted to 5-year time horizons. And so there's no possibility of extending, even no cost extension. So that deadline is very hard. And so when we're looking at large-scale compacts that are, $300, $400, $500 million, where all the activities need to be implemented and all the funds need to be dispersed at the end of those 5 years, there's extreme pressure on the timeline to get things done. So from our perspective, and I think this is a tension that our staff, weigh on a day-to-day basis. Is it faster for me to write the terms of reference for that procurement, or do I let the counterpart do it? Or do I go and travel to that country and sit side by side with the counterpart and spend the time and investment in having them understand how to do that, so the next time that we have to write a request for proposal, terms of reference, that my counterpart can do it on her own. And so this is a day-to-day, battle that our staff have, because this clock is ticking in the back of everyone's head constantly. And so, as MCC, I always talk to our staff that, your job is not to do, it's actually to teach, and it's actually to facilitate, and it's actually to mentor. And so that is, attendance, that's very hard, especially for a number of our type A staff people at MCC, to kind of step back a little bit and make sure that they are spending the time necessary to build that capacity and do it right. But I think, in conceptualizing these projects from the outset, we have to be realistic of what can be done. And so one of these sort of evolutions of MCC is not to have overly complex compacts. So in the earlier years, we had compacts that had 3 separate projects in 3 different sectors. You could have a roads project, a water project, and an electricity project. That's Tanzania 1. That was our first compact. And you would have among them something like 25 different project activities. And so it was quite unwieldy, and so it was really a race to the finish. And so MCC over the years, our last probably half a dozen compacts have been more focused on a single sector or maybe 2 sectors at the most. So we're trying to focus our efforts and our investments on sectors and go very deep into those sectors. And then also not have overly complicated compacts whereby you really are feeling this time pressure such that it sacrifices the capacity building that's necessary to really build country ownership and make sure that these projects continue after MCC leaves that country and that they're sustained. So I think that this tension, this time pressure for MCC is something that we have to balance with country ownership. But it is really, really important, I think, for us to always make sure that whatever we're doing in our mind has that country buy-in, that it's country driven, and that you are leaving capacity at the end of those 5 years.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to take this great conversation about risks and trade-offs, and I'm going to put a particular lens on it, one of fragile states. So quite a bit of USAID's development assistance goes to fragile states, and I think this is a funding trend we'll continue to see, especially as poverty is increasingly concentrated in these areas. And MCC also partners with a number of fragile states, although per its model, some of the relatively better governed ones. So fragile states bring a different set of risks to donors' work, yet often they are those that are most in need of the institutional capacity building that will enable them to take on a greater leadership role in donor efforts in the future. So Antoinette, you were Minister of Finance in Liberia shortly after the end of the Civil War. So I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit about donor appetite for risk at that time and how that fit with the country's needs for support.
Quite a question, and there are few people in the room who know that period quite well also from their time trying to support what Liberia was trying to do at the time. But certainly with the legacy of the Civil War and the legacy of very bad governance that had occurred at that time and also in the time of the interim government, donors were very, very reluctant to take any risk in terms of giving leadership on issues to the government at that time, with good reason in some ways. I don't know if people are familiar with something called at the time the Governance and Economic Management Assistance Program, which was a donor. It's not just by the U.S. government, but a donor sort of led program that had actually support technical assistance in place, but technical assistance that goes beyond just being an advisor as such, but actually helping to approve decisions, payments. For example, in the Ministry of Finance, we had a cash management committee that was supported at the time by technical people put in place by the World Bank, but that had to sign off on the list of payments we'd make on a weekly basis. And verifying the revenues that we said we had and had collected and all of that. A very intrusive program, of course, but one that I, as Minister of Finance, found actually quite helpful. Helpful for a number of reasons. Clearly, in that context, we had almost zero capacity in place. And we had a lot of bad governance still around, including in our legislature, in our Ministry of Finance, in many places. And it was a help to have what the donors are expecting, and as a sort of to stop bad practices and to help you get through some very difficult discussions with people in the legislature who wanted certain things paid that would mean completely no regard to the procedures that we had put in place for procurement and cash management and all of that. So very intrusive in the sense of course, taking authority away from the government in terms of being the final arbiter of things. But at the same time, very helpful in giving some space to start to do the right things or to start working to do the right things. But at the same time, of course, there's a real need to make sure that when that sort of assistance is provided, that a keen eye is kept on the need to really start to build that capacity so that donors leave that space, which is very difficult to explain to your population. That, in fact, we had a number of people that were called the GMAP people around everybody in Liberia knew who Mr. Kumar was, for example, at the Ministry of Finance, because it was often the case that people would say, oh, Mr. Kumar said we can't pay this. And of course, everybody would blame Mr. Kumar and this sort of thing. So it's a very difficult space for advisors to be in as well. So the sooner that you can exit that type of assistance, the better. So that's an extreme form of not having ownership and leadership. On the other hand, there are other extreme forms of in some fragile states and some interventions I've seen from the bank and from the IMF of wanting, of course, very much to give authority to the authorities, as we call them, right away, and taking some big risks sometimes in doing that. And I think one has to try to strike a balance when countries are just emerging from conflict with very little capacity, but with of course, a need to start building that capacity and to give some authority and to start building, helping them build capacity quickly. Of course, they're in a hurry to get results, and that's the other issue. There are times when it may take a huge amount of effort and time to build ownership. If by that, what we mean by ownership, meaning that there has to be such a broad consensus around things. And I'm talking about these things from the perspective of policy reform mostly, and not so much project issues. And building ownership for reform sometimes is hugely valuable. There may not be ownership for fundamental reform. What you don't want to do is to equate ownership with the status quo in countries and to not support some leaders who are trying to break the cycle of the way things have always been done.
Great, thank you. I hope to touch a little bit more on that policy reform conversation too, if we have time, which I hope we do. But just a little bit more on this note too. So Kay, MCC is also adding to its portfolio a number of countries that are considered fragile states. It's working in Liberia, which is a much different country than when Antoinette was finance minister at this time. It's been a decade. Niger as well has some particular challenges. So MCC's model of implementation, as you mentioned, is one that's very country-led, requires a lot of country capacity and commitment. So how does MCC, or how does MCC think about tailoring its model of country-led implementation in more fragile states?
Yeah, so this is a very good question, because it's true that in recent years we have started to work more with fragile states. You mentioned Niger and Liberia, also Cote d'Ivoire and Nepal I would also put in that category. And so let me just talk about one specific example, and that's with Niger, because this was particularly challenging for us, particularly in the compact development phase, is due to the security concerns in Niger. Our country teams would go out, and they were restricted to certain areas where they could travel due to security concerns. And then they also had to, if they did go out a certain number of kilometers outside of Niamey, they had to go with armed military guards. And so if you can imagine, our staff was saying, I'd like to do a gender consultation with this community, but I'm here with 2 military convoys, heavily armed. And it kind of leaves an impression on the community. And they also feel kind of exposed. So I think there was also a little bit of a, with our staff kind of struggled on a moral issue. Am I exposing these communities by trying to help them? But these consultations were very, very important, because we really needed to understand what are the needs of these communities, so that we could come up with a project that addressed these needs in a sustainable way. So the Niger example was particularly challenging for us. We ended up signing a compact last year, $437 million, which is quite significant for the country of Niger. And it focuses primarily on agriculture and then feeder roads associated with agriculture production. And the capacity issue and the country ownership issue were major concerns for us, because we said, again, if we do this all, then it's not building the capacity in the country. And so we need to make sure how to go at it in a way that we can implement kind of the MCC model type of projects where it really is in the hands of local organizations, local communities. But, spending $437 million in 5 years is really challenging in this environment. And so it required actually working with the central government, and this is in the design of the program, and there's a lot of technical assistance and capacity building for institutions at the central government, but also working all the way down to the local communities to make sure that, if we are building sort of irrigation infrastructure in these areas, that the farmers are well trained, that they are trained on, how to establish a water users association, for example, and that they really have the tools to manage their scarce resource of water in that country. They understand, what are the markets for various commodities, how to get their goods to market, and things like that. On the central government side, because water was identified as a major constraint, economic constraint for the country, we said, instead of us providing sort of the geospatial tools and saying, this is what your water situation looks like in the country, this is how much water your aquifers have, your recharge rates, what we're doing is we're building the capacity of the central government and those institutions so that they have this information on a regular basis and they can help make sort of political decisions on how water is used in the country, as opposed to just allowing people to basically drain the aquifers in this country. So it's required, I think, a lot of thinking about how to build that capacity at all different levels of the government and the local communities, while also being very cognizant of a lot of these sort of, exogenous shocks, with security being a major risk in Niger, and then also the environmental shocks as well, with climate change and such. So the good thing is, in the it's still early days in Niger, but we feel pretty hopeful and optimistic that our model can work in a fragile state environment. And we're learning from this, and we hope that these learnings can be applied to future countries.
Great, thank you. So Patricia, USAID works in a wide range of countries. It works in fragile states, it works in transition economies, and everything in between. And so rightly so, the operational guidance that USAID has it allows a lot of flexibility in how to implement the guidance to missions for how to involve local systems and local stakeholders in this process of getting toward locally and sustainable development. This makes sense, clearly. So one-size-fits-all requirements for country involvement in strategy development, program design, implementation wouldn't work for USAID. But given this, how can USAID encourage mission accountability for the effective implementation of locally owned sustainable development? And so how can it do so in a way that's useful to both individual missions in terms of allowing missions to understand what are the appropriate steps that they should be taking given their particular context to appropriately fulfill some of the spirit of the guidance? And then what is also useful to the agency as a whole for understanding how missions are implementing this in practice and thinking about general accountability for guidance implementation?
When you say accountability, you mean the ability to implement the policy?
Yes. How can USAID understand how can USAID in general hold missions to account for implementing the guidance in such a way that is appropriate for their context?
First of all, I think that the difference in our approach to the guidance is that we put out guidance and are allowing missions much more flexibility in how they, I think, I dropped the microphone last week. I thought we were having a fragility moment here. Sorry about that. I think I've got it. Is that okay? Thanks. Okay. Yeah. So I think there's a general issue of accountability, and we often think of that as a financial accountability, often to Congress but in this sense, what we've done is set out a new approach to how we do our business overseas. And the one document that comes in is the strategic planning document. And after that, we really give missions a range of options about how they do things to adapt it to their environment. And so the accountability is to the mission director, who has the responsibility for using the resources successfully and adapting the modalities to the situation. And I think what's challenging about fragile states, and as you were talking, I was thinking about it, there are different causes of fragility, and so you respond differently to them. There's military, there's physical issues, or there are political issues, or you can imagine there's different. And so what we've tried to do with the guidance is to give the flexibility so that it's fit for purpose. So that if you're in a politically fragile environment, the most important thing is to understand the context, monitor the context, and reach out to as many actors in that society as possible so you understand what's going on, and then working together to design the projects in a way that can be adaptable and are fit to the instability, right? And so what we've tried to set out as a continuum. I mean, I've been in aid a long time. It used to be that we worked in very stable states, and we went out for 4 years, and we went to the beach on Sundays, and it was a whole different view of the world. And now when we go out, we're really thinking. I mean, think Bangladesh right now, right? So how do you design a program in a growing level of instability in a way where you can work together and adapt it and monitor it to see if it's being successful? And I think one of our biggest challenges in fragile states where there is physical insecurity, right, is that it's hard for Americans to get out. We have the same issue, it's a security issue. So then the question becomes, how do you continue the program and monitor the program and know what's going on? And so we're trying to develop tools so that missions can do that. And one of the things that we rely on we have Foreign Service nationals that work in our missions, and they're able to get out into some of these areas a little better than we can. So what we're trying to do is set out a policy where missions can do what they need to do and be successful, and then we can give them the support from Washington if they need it, but it's much more trying to give them the tools and the wherewithal so that they can adapt what we're trying to do in that country to the situation in that country. And sometimes it's very, very difficult. It's a continuum. And other times there are areas of difficulty, and otherwise it's having a shorter term time frame. So it's not a 5-year strategy. If you're in a certain country and you're concerned and you're not sure what's, Zimbabwe comes to mind, then how long is that strategy, and what do you expect, and how do you monitor to know if you're doing well? So the missions keep themselves accountable in that sense, right?
Makes sense.
And what we hope then, in terms of being evidence-based and learning in a learning environment, is as we have more people working in these kind of environments, what are they learning and what are they sharing with us? And then what do we share peer-to-peer learning so that we learn together how you can do as effective development as possible working with local partners in difficult situations. But there's really a range of those kind of unstable situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions before we open it up to some audience questions as well. So the first one I want to ask, I want to sort of draw out a little bit more something that you mentioned, Patricia, earlier about the bigger question around evidence of sort of the country ownership approach. So again, I think there's country ownership of programs is widely considered to be critical for program results and sustainability, but this is mostly based on theory, intuition, and some scattered anecdotal evidence. There's not really a robust body of evidence to back this up at this point. So, given the position that the 2 agencies, MCC and USAID, are in with their respective focuses on country ownership, although implemented in slightly different ways, again, sort of, how are you, you mentioned some of the steps that USAID is considering taking to sort of add to this, currently sort of sparse evidence base on, the additive value of doing business in this way with an ownership approach. So I'd be interested to hear more from you, Patricia, and Kay also, if you have anything to say about how MCC is thinking about this as well.
Shall I go first? Would you like to go first? I think there were questions in the document about value for money. And I think it's a tough one, right? Because we have to define value. And so, the assumption is, and we're talking about risk, there might be a much bigger risk of not building local ownership than building local ownership, but it's a long short-term risk. I was thinking about that. But, if we, the value of, have I done it again? No. The value of local ownership, right? And how do you, so I'm not sure we have to define value in terms of local ownership, because you're right, we assume that it brings value, but what do we mean by that, right? And how do you measure that? So I have a little trouble with your question about the value issue, right? But I think what we need to do is, in each case, and this is what we're trying to do, or in the process of doing actually, is going out to missions and suggesting that they develop customized cases of local ownership and set up indicators of those cases and customize the indicators so that we can learn about what is happening in terms of local ownership, what are the indicators of success, and what are the linkages to sustainability. And if we begin to have case studies that give us that information, we'll begin to understand what it is, what is the value that we're trying to build in terms of local ownership. But that's in the short term. I think over the longer term, the way that we're beginning to think about it is that we have to do ex post evaluations to really look and see what explicitly set up programs that we intend to use to build, not to build the evidence, to get the evidence to see, and then looking after the fact in terms of the local ownership, the links, and the sustainability. It's very complicated. And I'm struck that we as a group of development professionals are just beginning to explore this, right? So I have trouble with defining the value, because I think it's a question of the quality added and the time it takes to realize it. So I think a whole nother discussion that this group could have is about value for money and what do we need, does local ownership add value, right? But I think we need to have more evidence before we can start to have that kind of conversation.
I think this is a challenging question, because I think the premise of MCC is really based on country ownership. So if we want to say country ownership is successful, then I think that we're basically assessing, have our projects been successful? And so what do we mean by that? And I think, that's something that we have lots of existential conversations about this internally and externally. Have we been successful? Have we actually achieved results? Have we actually reduced poverty? And so there are a number of ways that we've assessed this. We can look at our monitoring and evaluation results and, whether we've actually, let's say, met the economic rate of return on these particular projects. So that's something that we monitor and we evaluate on a regular basis. The other is, I think something that we're looking at that we think is very important is, what I call sort of the beyond the compact impact. And that's saying that, if we put a project or policy in place, is that sustained afterwards? Is it brought to scale? Is it something that the country really owns and takes on? So we have a number of very, I think, good examples that prove this. So, for example, in our first compact with the Philippines, we built the standards of the roads to be basically, climate resistant or typhoon proof. And so we built certain standards, technical specifications in the road design. And when the Typhoon Haiyan hit a couple of years ago, our road actually sustained the incredible force of that typhoon. And I think it was a testament to what we did in the design. And I think it provided basically evidence to the country that this is something that they should do on a nationwide scale, and it's something that the Philippines government is working on right now. Another example in Morocco is based on our environmental guidelines, which require a lot of public consultation with the communities, the affected communities. That's something that they've built into their practices on a national scale. So to me, those are impacts that go beyond the 5-year investment. It's beyond sort of the concrete in the ground, but it's something that has much broader implications and implications that will happen past our 5-year time horizon.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. I would like to hear from everybody about this, but I'm going to direct my question to you, Antoinette. I mentioned I wanted to talk a little bit more about policy reform, and country ownership is a key part of this. In fact, some of the earliest discussions around country ownership back in the 1990s that were emerging from both the World Bank and the IMF were around sort of the conditionality question of conditioning aid on policy reforms. So you're most recently at the IMF, which is often deeply involved in a lot of structural reform kinds of conversations. And like most reforms, these can face opposition from vested interests. So how should owners think, or donors think about applying the principle of ownership in the face of opposition, either when that opposition comes, sort of directly from core parts of the government, or when there are competing views of sort of how to proceed within the government itself. So no government is a monolith, and so certainly when donors are in conversations with other governments, there may be different views within the government with which they're working on the best way forward. So how should donors think about ownership in that kind of context?
Yeah, that's a tough one, but a very good one, obviously. And there's an issue of timing also involved in the sense of clearly the first best way, I think, to address what are genuine maybe differences of views or concerns on the part of the country authorities that you're dealing with at the time. Is to bring to their table and to bring to their knowledge what other countries have done, starting in a similar way that they had, or from a similar beginning point, and what lessons can be learned from how they were able to manage the trade-offs and the difficult issues involved in charting a reform path. But that takes time, obviously, and that takes patience also. There are times when countries, of course, needing to reform, need to do it urgently because they're running out of reserves, because they have a shock that they have to manage. They have to respond on the macro side to that shock. And so there's a balance there that you have to strike in terms of wanting to take the time to help them get over their differences of views. And also needing to make sure that they don't actually collapse because they have not addressed these very real stability, macro stability issues. So a tough one, I think. It helps, I think, partners like the IMF to certainly have their ears closer to the ground than maybe the IMF had in the past. I think about, it's still the case that the IMF has much less ground presence than the World Bank and others. But it is the case that there's a lot more that is being invested, for example, into outreach, into dialogue with different parts of the society, stakeholders, to actually bring some better understanding of the macro constraints and the macro issues that countries have and that require support across the board for governments to be able to make very difficult decisions sometimes. So having that presence on the ground where you actually do all of the things you were talking about in terms of listening and knowing what's going on politically is as important to macro issues as it is to project issues sometimes, because it really helps to try to arbitrate the difficult trade-offs sometimes with knowing what the population is willing to bear or not. But there are also times, I think, when institutions like the IMF and the bank and others have a real role to take in taking risk sometimes, with taking risk in the sense of not fiduciary risk, but taking risk to support a view that may seem at a point in time to be a view of one or a few people. To take risk with those, because in addition to ownership, you need leadership in these countries to make a difference, to change the path that countries have been on for a long time. And that risk is a real risk, because there's no guarantee that supporting this particular Minister of Finance or someone else who, based on what they've seen in other countries, want to chart the same type of road for their reform program, and are being confronted on a daily basis by vested interests fighting against those things. There are times when institutions like that have to try to support those individuals. And it can be done in various ways. I mean, it can be done because they invest more in themselves, reaching out to the legislature, for example, to really make it clear that it's not this ambitious Minister of Finance just trying to force things down your throat, but it's actually the best practice from across the globe that we've seen, that they're trying to adapt to your own circumstances. So there's a role of taking risks to support, to be seen as supporting a particular view that may be at odds with the broad view at one point in time.
It's not an easy task.
Not an easy task, no.
Well, this is a great question. I have many more questions I could ask of these three experts here, but I'm sure you do too. So I'd like to open it up to the audience for any questions. I see one there, and then one here. Do we have microphones? Okay, sure. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Yaya Fanusi with United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. As I listen to you all, and most of you in here are involved in development. So in a broader sense, it's a conceptual issue on change. I used to be a professor in this area. So after listening to you, I said, how could I say something to them that will help them understand the dilemma of prediction? I want you to go research a psychological experiment that was done in Stanford University, Department of Psychology. I think it's in the late 60s or early 70s, in which they put 20 monkeys in a room. I don't know if some of you are aware of that. And then they have a ladder which goes to a point. And then when one of them tried to go up the ladder to go touch the banana, they spray the rest of them. They spray the rest of them with ice water. And they start taking each one out to experience that. So if you go do that, you go listen to it, and see how you could put that in the context of what you're trying to do. You will know what I'm trying to tell you, how you should see, and come up with the appropriate way to meet the benefits that you said you didn't understand is possible.
Thank you, ladies. I'm aware that this is an all-female panel, which in itself says something about ownership and the way ownership should go. Antoinette, you were very eloquent in your talk about reaching out to the broader population in various ways. And I'd like the two others of you from MCC and USAID to talk about how you include the multiple stakeholders in a country. Yeah. The World Bank is grappling now with new guidelines on practice, and one of those has to do with expanding the dialogue with people in those countries and how to do that. So talk some more how you have sometimes recalcitrant leadership. You have leadership that realizes they're hanging on by their fingertips. So how do you expand the dialogue? What has worked, and what can you share there?
Want to go first? I'm happy to answer that. I think it's a very good question. I mean, I think what Antoinette said, about the fact that you need to have leadership in the country to take sort of bold positions so that you can actually make change and reform is really important. One thing that we've learned, I mean, MCC has, I think, the privilege of having access to high government officials. So when we go into country, we can meet with the head of state because we're giving them $500 million of free money. So it kind of opens the door. And just a specific case, I'll talk about Ghana recently, which many of you are familiar that President Mahama actually lost to his opponent Akufo-Addo in this recent election. And so we had signed a compact for close to $500 million that was all about energy in Ghana. And one of the conditions that were on this compact was that there needed to be private sector participation in the main utility because the utility was completely in the red, had been poor performing, and we felt like we couldn't actually put the $500 million unless there was a severe management change for this utility. And so we went through an analysis with the Ghanaians, and they decided that they wanted to concession the utility. And so we had many meetings with President Mahama, and he said, yes, yes, yes. I strongly, he made public statements about it. And what happened is that there weren't enough champions actually in the government and then in other areas of the country. And so it became very much, the media stories have been, the Americans are trying to privatize, the electricity company of Ghana, and they're selling the electricity company of Ghana to the Americans, and all of this false media around it. And so we did have the champion at the highest level, but we didn't have the champions at leadership level with the utility company. We didn't have champions within the labor unions. With the actual public, we had made a push to do a communications campaign, but even the public were very concerned. They said, what are the implications of this? Are tariffs going to rise? Are we actually going to get more reliable and affordable electricity as a result of this investment? And so, it's something that we continually grapple with, and making sure that when we are asking for very tough sort of policy and institutional reforms, that we have broad-based consultation and we have broad-based buy-in. Because when we say country ownership, who is the country? If we said country ownership for the United States, I don't know if anyone could really define who the country is, So I think that is, I take that point very seriously when we're approaching these, our country partners, is that they are not monolithic, and we have to approach them in a very, very comprehensive way and look at, who are the champions and the advocates, and really use those champions and advocates. But we need to build more champions and advocates. We also have to know who the adversaries are as well. And this has been, I think, a very challenging lesson for MCC, but it's a really important one that we need to tackle, because policy and institutional reform is very central to making sure that our investments are effective and sustainable.
I think that's an excellent response, and it's a great question. And I'm just sitting here thinking, I think it's much easier to do it in countries that are open and democratic, and where bilateral donors and others are welcome to go and talk to as many people as you need and understand some of the complex systems in a country. And if some of the groups come up with positions against the government's willing to listen to other. Liberia's coming to mind under Johnson Sirleaf, right? So, right, that's an easier situation, but it's still very, very complicated. It depends what level you're working at. If you're working at a low level, an activity level, perhaps it's you understand those. But as you raise up and you're really working at higher and higher levels to understand what's going on in the country, really understand it and understand allies and non-allies, it's very complicated. So it's a very, very good question, and I think that's the challenge, right? It's much harder in a place where, well, and of course I work for a bilateral donor, it's much harder in a place where we have foreign policy objectives, which are about stability and supporting certain governments or whatever, which one has. And then and development in terms of objectives isn't at the top of the heap. Development's important, but it's not what's driving our reason for being in that country. Then I think it becomes more and more difficult. But it's still, at whatever level, to be successful, you have to be understanding local context and working with local actors and getting their buy-in at whatever level. But it's very complicated, and there's no easy answer, as we all know, right? And we've also had some successes, and then we've had other things where we didn't understand the context well enough, and it was very difficult to have a successful program. And that's, I think, the challenge of the local ownership, is defining it and understanding it and knowing where you are and how much you can do and how successful you can be. And what I think is you never get it right, and so you have to keep understanding and learning more and then expanding it. And you also have to admit when really you're not going to be able to succeed, and that's tougher. That's tougher, but it's a very good question.
Okay, I see a question here, and back here, yes.
Thank you. My name is Judith Ofori. I am a Ghanaian and very interested in that intervention. And I also work for the African Development Bank. And so a development practitioner working in gender and social impact. On First, on country ownership. I don't know much about the work systems in the states of USAID or MCC, but from the perspective of African Development Bank, we work with the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness, in which your systems, we are supposed to work with the country systems to integrate, in with all, making sure that the interventions are, the country systems are used. So with that, it makes it a lot easier for the integration, the working systems, and when the capacity is not there, then there can be targeted interventions and looking at how to build institutional capacities. A lot of emphasis in stakeholder participation and engagement. When we look at and invariably looking towards ownership, with sustainability as the ultimate goal, because when there is ownership, then sustainability is more guaranteed, not always, but, with ownership. So I wanted to find out how you integrate or use country systems, because if you don't use country systems or work with country systems, it is a lot more difficult for any intervention, development-wise, to blend or work with countries. So as I don't know of MCC work or USAID, because we haven't done any bilaterals or work with you, so I'm not very sure of your systems. But I was just going to find out how well you work with country systems, because I remember in one of your interventions you talked about whether the dilemma or question of developing proposals for calls for proposals or working with the countries or projects, units, whether it wastes time or to enable them to do it better the next time. So that maybe suggested to me that you weren't working with the country system. Because if you were, then you could have used the procurement rules, and maybe where there was conflict, then you could come to an agreement to see how it will work with your MCC procurement rules. The same, I don't know, for USAID. So from the perspective of the African Development Bank, or knowing our countries, that is the sort of thing we do. And I think, there are levels of success, various levels of success if you work that way. So the second one, coming to the Ghanaian aspect of that intervention, very interesting about the energy project, the 500 million, and maybe your reference to miscommunication or maybe not getting the right message across. I think a lot of people will know that Ghana is one of, I'm very proud Ghanaian in a way. Ghana is one of the countries that has such free information service. The media is so free, and the one who shouts loudest may get heard, whether they may be saying the truth or not. So this thing about not maybe having champions, there may be champions, but those champions don't shout the loudest. And because elections was just recent, and there was the political temperature was very high. So maybe the timing was not very favorable to the government, because it was mid-term. Then a lot of things they were doing with donors and interventions, it would have been easier to address those things, but the pre-election fever didn't make it easy for those messages and communications to come through. Thank you.
We'll take one over here, and then we can try to, I'm going to take one more, too, actually, from this gentleman over here after you, and then we'll answer those last three, and then,
So I work for the Tony Blair Africa Governance Initiative, and we take a very, you might say, a very purist view of government ownership, and really try to live that. I'm interested in the issue of sort of government policy choice, and if there have been moments in any of your careers working with various development partners, including you, Antoinette, where you basically disagreed with your counterparts, the policy they were pushing for, whether that's maybe tacking towards using community health workers in the health sector when, your experts thought they should do something else, and whether you ever kind of went with the government's choice despite what you thought was not the right thing, and when you think that's sort of the right thing to do as a partner.
Okay. All right, last question over here. And
Hi, Richard Ponzio with the Stimson Center. I understand our focus was on MCC and USAID and implementing local ownership. I'm glad our colleague from Ghana mentioned, though, the Paris Declaration. There have been many other frameworks since coming out of Paris, the Accra and Busan aid effectiveness platforms really emphasizing local ownership. We mentioned fragile states today in the New Deal initiative, and of course the SDGs. Now, my question is, to what extent do development agencies, bilateral such as USAID and MCCC, come on board because of pressures from the international community, or is it more from below and from the host nations you're there to serve and work with? And secondly, though, on this question of going forward, now that everybody has embraced local ownership, how do these international frameworks and mechanisms really distill best practice on issues of avoiding and managing risk that Ms. Rader referred to, and of course the ultimate goal of delivering better development outcomes?
okay, great. So I suppose I will, why don't we follow up with, each one of you can have a couple minutes to respond to any of those questions. The ones we heard were, how do you think about using systems? And then a question specifically about the Ghana Compact. The other one is the question about government choice. Do you sometimes go with something that a government chooses, even though that's not necessarily the preference of the donor? And then the last question was about the Paris Declaration and other frameworks. How does that influence how agencies are operating? And then after each one of you makes brief remarks, I will note that we can continue the conversation in the back. We have drinks available as well. So as you leave after the concluding comments from the panelists, feel free to stick around and we can talk country ownership some more over some drinks. So, okay, Kate.
So I'm not gonna directly answer all the questions, but I'm just going to answer generally the question that hopefully addresses some of the elements of those three questions. So I'll do my best. MCC was given this amazing opportunity with having no-year funding from Congress. And so this provides the ability for us to sign 5-year compacts. And then, our mandate of working with the countries and having the countries determine their priorities and actually implement the programs provides us, again, with another opportunity, again, for buy-in, sustainability, effectiveness, all of that. And a lot of these, I think, are in line with the Paris Declaration. However, at the same time, with these opportunities come responsibility and accountability. And so I think that's where some of the limitations come in, where we would like to use the country's systems wholesale, but there are some restrictions that are actually statutorily restricted for MCC. And therefore, in the case of MCC, we have our own procurement guidelines. A lot of them are very similar, I think, to World Bank procurement guidelines, but they're not the country's procurement guidelines. And addressing, I think, the gentleman's question of where we've kind of gone head-to-head with this with the countries where there's been disagreement. When I was negotiating the Namibia Compact several years ago, they almost walked away and said, you can take your $300 million, we're going to go. And the big issue was procurement, because they had requirements for local businesses, and they had a certain quota for this, and they really wanted us to use their national procurement guidelines, and they felt like as a sovereign nation, that and it's really important in this sort of post-apartheid era that we use these. And so we went head-to-head with them on that. We were able to find a compromise where we were able to modify some of our procurement guidelines to accommodate some local providers in that for sort of smaller value procurements. But it was a very, very contentious issue where they almost walked away. We almost had to walk away as well, and you've got $300 million left on the table. So that was, I think, a very tricky situation. because we're providing the money to the government, and there are a lot of people in the United States Congress that are quite opposed to that, we have to make sure that we have fiduciary sort of guardrails around our funding. So we do typically have a third-party, sort of what we call fiscal agent, financial manager, as well as a third-party procurement agent that comes in and makes sure that the procurements are in line with our procurement guidelines. We also make our payments directly from the US Treasury to the vendor. So much of the money actually doesn't actually flow to the government, but it does actually pay for the projects, the technical assistance, the supplies, and everything that these projects need to actually be completed. And so this is where the tension lies, is that with this ability to have 5-year compacts, our average compact is around $350 to $400 million, and that's all grant money, and we're putting the ownership in the country. We are restricted in some of the things that we can do in terms of going wholesale using the country systems, and wholesale using some of the country requirements and the procedures.
Yes. Also working for the U.S. government, also held responsible as stewards of U.S. taxpayer resources. In aid, historically, we've had separate financing systems. And what we've done as part of, I guess, local solutions and government funding is really looking for opportunities where we can fund directly into governments. And to be able to do that, we have an assessment that we do, whether of the different ministries that we're working with, to determine whether or not the systems are strong enough so that we feel comfortable and we can account to Congress for what we've done. And the case in point was in Liberia, where we did an assessment of several ministries because ministries were looking for government-to-government assistance to do the work. And the health FARA that you mentioned, the Ministry of Health had very, very strong internal systems. And so we identified that the systems were strong enough that we felt comfortable giving money originally to the Ministry of Finance, but then directly to the Ministry of Health. And there were a couple systems that were not as strong in the Ministry of Health, and then we worked with other partners to work on those specific systems so that we could strengthen them, so we could feel comfortable that not only could we use the financial system, we could use the procurement system. So yeah, we have to be assured that the money will be well used, but it's kind of a combination of government to government and then capacity building, so that what you want at the end of the day, it's funneling the money that strengthens the system and also working with it to make sure that it stays strong. So more and more we're trying to be able to do that, but we have to maintain certain standards, or otherwise the whole thing would fall apart. I wanted to answer your question about the Paris Declaration. I think it's a really good one, and I've gone round and round on that. I think it's circular, because I think that this development effectiveness doesn't come out of whole cloth, right? It's an evolution of how donors are thinking, multilaterals are thinking, recipient governments, partners are thinking, and it kind of moves forward. So there's kind of a global consensus that moves. And so I think some of the major donors are probably major inputs into that consensus, and some of the more active Southern partners are, and so as I've seen it since 2005, it really is a consensus that moves, right? So we kind of support it and then respond to it. And so I think it's easier to support it in theory than it is to practice what you preach. And so I think that this move now that the U.S. government, that aid has into supporting local ownership and supporting local systems really comes out of that. But we have to do it in a fairly conservative way, because we have to make sure that our resources are safe. So I think it's a way that the globe's moving more generally, and that's what you see. And I think the more that we have evidence that it works, and the more that our partner countries step up and take responsibility for their part of that consensus, I think that we'll continue to move forward. But it's a really good question. Yeah.
Final remarks.
Just on the use of country systems, and clearly in an ideal world, and the first best, I think, way of really forging ownership and really making sure that country priorities are what drive donors' support and their projects is to the extent that countries' budgets reflect their development priorities is to actually use their budgets to channel resources to finance major sectors like health and education and sectors that really need to build systems of the health systems and really reforms across a sector and not so much on a project basis. Clearly the ideal way for donors to make sure that they're helping countries build their capacity and not using their scarce time managing multiple procurement systems that different donors have is to use one system through the budget. But you've underscored the risk that they may be to doing that in countries that have less capacity in procurement or have not developed those systems well enough. But we know that it's really learning by doing that forges capacity sometimes. And to the extent that donors continue to be reluctant to permit countries to learn by doing, it just takes that much longer to build that capacity. So I think those are the trade-offs one has to worry about all the time. But the simplest way to forge ownership and priority alignment is to have one system, I think. Anyway, but on your question, Dan, on whether one goes with what the country wants, even if there are differences of views sometimes, certainly that's been the case. Certainly in my work with the fund, I would say, there are times when the pace of fiscal adjustment that the fund would advise a country to put in place and to implement is seen as much more demanding political economy-wise and ownership-wise than the fund would want. And there are times when the fund does go along with a slower pace of that fiscal adjustment, but it has to be something that is also financeable. And that's, you have to finance that time or that pace of adjustment. It needs to be financed, so you have to really make sure you're getting that financing somehow. And so that's what constrains sometimes the willingness to go the country way, because countries know their own political circumstances a lot better than we do, and than the fund does sometimes. But there are constraints in doing that also if you're working to make sure that countries are able to actually generate that stability that they need to. So, but that's part of the negotiation around country programs, a lot of it around how quickly can we get the VAT producing these returns that you want, and how quickly can we put into place a higher VAT rate or not, and all of those things. Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Thank you as an audience. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And again, for those who are interested and able, we have some drinks outside, and please continue the country ownership conversation out there. Thank you.